Alright. Ayan. So our lecture for this afternoon is about nature of freedom and responsibility. The concept of freedom and responsibility is sandwiched inside the nature of freedom. So papansinin nyo, doon din tayo pupunta no, after talking about nature of freedom. Last week, we talked about the broader sense or the broader concept of freedom, particularly the aspect of freedom, the faculty of freedom, wherein we have been given that ability or capacity to choose between options. We have real options, therefore we are free, therefore we have free will. Now we will talk about the nature of freedom. The main question of this lecture is this. Asan na yun? Ayan. For us to understand the nature of freedom, it is necessary, first of all, to establish in what way the free act develops itself. Saan nagmula? Paano nabuo? Paano na-develop ang free act wherein we exercise our freedom, we perform our freedom? Saan ano yung prosesong pinagdaanan niya? So that's the big question for this lecture. What are the processes involved so that the free act will be developed? Now, according to authors, particularly Thomas Aquinas and some philosophers, there are three principal moments in the free act. Three principal moments in the free act. Number one, deliberation. Number two, judgment. And number three, election. By the way, in the entire lecture, I want you to pay attention kasi yung written work nyo towards the end of our lecture will be based on the lecture. At kapag hindi nyo nakuha ng tama iyon, definitely mali. Alright? Sir, don't state the obvious. Pag hindi mo talaga nakuha, talagang mali. No? Walang consideration, yun ang kailangan kong sabihin. So, take down notes if it's necessary. Babagalan ko ng konti para makasulat talaga kayo. Ano? Kasi hindi naman lahat ay nakikita nyo sa slide. Alright, again, there are three principal moments in the free act. Number one, deliberation. Number two, judgment. And the third, election. Let's define each one. Deliberation is the phase of exploration. Ayan. Ibig sabihin, kung it is the phase of exploration, it is safe to assume that what we are to deliberate is already there. It's given. It is knowable. Kasi we will only explore it. We will only research it, but it's there. Parang parang yung laws of nature, yung laws of physics, the laws of sciences, those are not invented, those are not created by scientists, those are explored. They were researched, no? Because of the inquiries, because of the questions of the brilliant minds na nag-aaral ng mga ito. So that's deliberation. It is the phase of exploration, research and inquiry about the object of the acquisition or the action to perform. Next will be judgment. Judgment is the phase of evaluation. Kaya nga kami mga teacher, habang wala pa yung evaluation, habang hindi pa namin na-check yung mga binigay namin sa inyong mga task, wala pa kaming judgment. Kasi wala pang evaluation. The same thing goes. Before we begin to have that decision, there is some sort of evaluation. Later, I'll elaborate. And the third will be election. Election is the phase of decision. Take note, this is not the literal election na ginagawa natin every 3 years for the Senate and the local government, and every 6 years for the president and the vice president. Election is simply electio, the choosing, the act of choosing. Election is the phase of decision. Ayan. So that's the three principal moments in the free act. Now, the free act requires, first of all, deliberation. That which is wished to be done is known because it's already there. And therefore implies an examination of the action that is wished to be performed or the object that is wished to be reached. Ito yung isang interpretation ng isang study, hindi ko maalala kung anong year, 1970s or 1980s, the one that used to debunk free will. Kaya lang later on, because of further studies, it actually supported the notion of free will. Because there is this moment in our mind wherein we do not really know what to choose, but we are the neurons of the brain, or the activity of the brain, is in pause, or is in gap, tending to choose which one to select. It is an attentive examination of the action that is wished to be performed, or the object that is wished to be reached. And that is what we normally do as human persons. For example, ako mahilig ako bumili ng books, ano? For example, I want to buy a particular book that will be helpful for me in my masters. Yun lang lagi kong aim eh. If I am going to buy a book, it must be in the service of my study. And then later on, in the service of the other people who will benefit from my endeavor. So, before I buy a book, diba, kailangan, what they call this, kailangan mayroon kang iniisip muna, is this book beneficial for me? That's one. And number two, how much does it cost? Ang mga books ko usually nag-range siya ng 900 to 2,500. Kung may mga iba nasa 4,000 or 5,000, kasi ganun kamamahal ang mga books. Parang medicine book ng mga books sa laws and medicine. You need to take into consideration those factors, those given data. If it is good, of course, it's given. That's why you need the book, because it's good. And how much does it cost? Will you not, pangatlo kong tanong, will I not survive my masters without this book? Kasi if I can survive my master, if I can still, what do you call this? If I can still, hindi, ayoko kasi ng word na simply to pass, no? I don't want that. Will I excel without this book? Or will I excel with this book? Yun yung mga consideration. Kaya nga, in that aspect, andoon yung si deliberation, and then papasok si judgment. Kasi I will be evaluating what will be the pro and what will be the con of buying such book. What will be the pro? What will be the advantages? And what are the disadvantages? If it is worthwhile or not. Yan. Sa atin naman, no, ilagay natin sa konteksto natin sa Pilipinas. On May 9, we will elect our leaders. We will elect our leaders. I hope it passed through, number one, our deliberation, and number two, our evaluation, our judgment, before we come up with the third, no, which is election, the phase of decision, the moment that we shade the circle around the name of our candidates, no, that is the phase of election already. We have already made our choice. Sa ngayon kasi, tayo ay nasa naka-freeze pa tayo sa moment. Although meron na tayong mga sinusuportahan mga candidates, we are still frozen in the moment. Kasi ngayon, since wala pa tayong ginagawang action, wala pa tayong sinashade na bilog sa tabi ng pangalan ng ating candidates, ang tawag dyan ay nasa abstract valuation pa tayo. Kasi hanggang ngayon, I suppose hanggang ngayon, nagwe-weigh pa din tayo ng pro and cons, mga pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages. Kasi to tell you honestly, kasi kung paano niyo ikikwento sa iba kung bakit niyo iboboto yung mga candidates niyo, it should be based on that. The valuation of the pros and the cons. It's not just simply sabi kasi ni, nabasa ko kasi. You must be very clear as to the advantages and the disadvantages. And I bet that the judgment that you made in your evaluation of values, kasi we are talking about values in selecting our candidates as well, the judgment is practical. It's a practical one. It must be worthwhile for me in this moment, not worthwhile for you or others for this in this moment, but worthwhile for me. Now, if the judgment takes on these characteristics, then the act of election is put into action. And yun na nga, no, pag nag-shade na tayo sa May 9, it will be put into action. Now, the free act consummates itself in election. The climax, the consummation of the finish line for the free act will be the election. But that phase of free act is a complex act. The result, because our election, our decision making, is a result of a dialogue. It is a conversation between our intellect and our will. Our intellect is focused more on what is truth. That's the object of intellect. I hope you can still remember our lesson 1 in philosophy. The object of the intellect is truth. But the object of the will is the good. Hindi sila pwede magkakasalungat. Kasi since they are overlapping, they tend to go forward together, not in the opposite direction. The intellect and the will should move forward together. It's a dialogue between the two. It is in our mind. Now, Thomas Aquinas maintains that the free act belongs substantially to the will, as most scholars. Sinasabi ng ibang mga philosophers, free act belongs to the will, and then si free will. But for Aquinas, not simply or not the primacy of the will, but the free act also depends essentially on the intellect. Kasi sabi ni Aquinas, excuse me, the word choice implies something belonging to reason or intellect and something belonging to the will. Something belonging to the will. Most sasabihin niya, bakit something belonging to the will? Because the will, excuse me, uubo lang ako. Bakit belonging to the will? Most sinasabi. Kasi the will is always at the side of good. It is always attracted to the good. No? It is always attracted to the good. Kaya malakas ang hatak. Kaya nga tayo, yung mga choices na ginagawa natin sa buhay, especially yung mga higher values, hindi yung mga hindi naman kailangan talagang sabihin natin na may moral implications. But the higher values na kasama sa ating mga moral, may mga moral implications. Nagsaside lagi ang will natin sa good. Pansinin ninyo how we react if there are social injustices, if there are inequalities, if there are suppression of rights, if there are disrespect to the dignity of the human person, we react. Because the will always sides on the good. The will always sides sa good. That's the implication of what Aquinas wants to say here. Now, freedom is the faculty which the human person enjoys to determine himself or herself to an action and to being its cause. After having taken consciousness, underline the word, consciousness, after having taken consciousness of the considerations that such an action carries for his or her life. When we make decisions, first and foremost, we also take into consideration, what is it for me? How will this impact the rest of my life? Bago ka pumunta sa how will it affect or how will it impact the life of others, nandun muna tayo sa how will it impact, how will it affect my life in general, my future. Now, from Aquinas' acute analysis of the free act of freedom, it results that this is a copiously complex and dynamic act. And it does not consist completely in that indifference before opposing alternatives. Hindi siya, last year pinag-usapan natin, opposing, opposites, no? Dalawang contradictories. But for Aquinas, It does not simply consist completely in knowing opposing alternatives about which some philosophers spoke about, but free act consists in the responsible choice, election, responsible choice or election of one of various alternatives after, we write this down, after a pondered examination of what? Of all the possible alternatives, including the pros and cons. Consciousness, you have pondered the examination of all possible alternatives, including the pros and the cons. Having said this, since tayo ay human person, ang mga animals hindi nila pinagdadaanan yung ganito kakomplikadong proseso. Ang pinagkapareho natin sa animals, yung processes of the human body. The processes of the human body, but not the processes of the mind. Not the process of the soul. The intellect and the will is in the soul. It's not in the mind. It's not in the brain. It's in the soul. Yan ang pinagkaiba natin sa kanila. Kaya nga, if we have that consciousness that animals do not have, we have the ability, we have the capability to ponder, to examine all possible alternatives, including the pros and the cons. Sabi yan, deliberation et judicium, before the judgment. Therefore, if we have that capacity, it is safe to assume that the human person is the author of the free act. The human person is the author of the free act. Kaya pala, diyan papasok si concept na responsibility. If the human person is the author of the free act, there is only one person who is responsible for the action. The human person who performed the act himself or herself. It's not God who is responsible for that. It's not the angels. It's not the devil. It's you. It's the self, the human person. Sabi dyan, no, even if one does not exclude help from others. Kasi sabi natin sa UCSP, no, paulit-ulit, if the human person is a social being, the human person is, in one way or another, will be influenced by others. Therefore, even sometimes even our judgment, even our decision making will be influenced by others. That's what it meant here by without excluding help from others. Because the human person, we are neither an absolute nor an isolated being, but rather we are essentially social. But we cannot point na siya ang may kagagawan kung bakit ko naisip iyon. Hindi. Kasi the author of the action is the person himself or herself. Na-influence ka man ng iba, but still, the author of the action, the author of the free act is the person who performed the action. It's not the others. Kaya nga, kung balikan natin si Oedipus, hindi niya naiwasan yung tinatawag na fate. The author of the free act of Oedipus is himself. It's not the oracle. It's not his biological parents. It's not the adoptive parents, but Oedipus himself. The cause of the free act is the person who fulfills it. Not God, ulitin ko ulit, or the angels, or demons, or the stars, nature, etc., etc. Nor is it the unconscious mind. Kasi pinaulit-ulit ko kanina, it must be conscious. There is this consciousness of the considerations that such an action carries for his or her life. The cause of the free act is the person who fulfills it. He or she is the only one responsible for the act that he or she fulfilled. Now, undeniably, kahit na merong nakaakibat na responsibility ito, freedom is a gift. Freedom is a gift, unique in the entire immense realm of nature. Unique in the entire or immense realm of nature, because only the human person possesses freedom. Only the human person possesses freedom, while all other things of this world lack it. Tayo lang. At again, the justification for saying this is the embodiment of the Spirit. Mamaya ulitin ko ulit yun. We have the intellect and the will, na wala yung ibang components and other species of this world. Tayo lang ang meron nun. Now, having said this, maaaring pumapasok sa isip ng iba, edi ibig sabihin, if uh, freedom is a unique gift to the human person, because the other part of the world or the created cosmos, walang freedom, they lack it. It is safe to assume that nature is the realm of determinism, while the human person is the realm of freedom. Since the human person lang ang may freedom. Kaya nga hindi tayo pwedeng pumunta sa opposite extremes like some philosophers and psychologists. Others tell us that we are only determined, absolutely determined. Ibig sabihin, lahat na ay nakasalalay sa mga scientists, even the subatomic particles, the movement of the particles, lahat ay determined na. No? Doon pa lang sa pinaka-minute na details up until the biggest details, those are determined. Therefore, there's no freedom. Yung other extreme naman, there is no such thing as determination, only freedom, absolute freedom. Ibig sabihin, freedom is not limited. Freedom is absolute, freedom is infinite. Both are incorrect, by the way. Kasi Aquinas and some other philosophers will try to reason out that nature, the biological nature, the nature itself, is the realm of determinism, while the human person is the realm of freedom. In that sense, there is in the human person that is determined, our biology. That's determined already. Those are written in our DNA already. Because that's matter. You are also made up of matter. Don't forget. Therefore, there is part of the human person that is determined. And matter follows the laws of nature. Nature is the realm of determinism. But we must not forget that the human person is not just made up of matter. The human person is also spirit, body and soul. The embodiment of the spirit. Yan ang pinag-uumpisahan natin eh. Bakit itong pinag-uumpisahan ng philosophy? Embodiment of the spirit. Kasi sabi ko nga, ulit-ulit ako, useless na pag-usapan si freedom, si intersubjectivity, si death. If we will only hear or listen to the other side, to the other extreme. Science is the master, is the great teacher of the other extreme, the deterministic attitude. But sabi nga natin, not everything can be answered by science. There is that limitation because that's the nature of physical substances. There's a limit to matter. The concept of freedom comes from this human personhood wherein we are also part of a substance called spirit. We have spiritual substance. We have a soul that is freer compared to the matter that is making up our body. Nature is the realm of determinism, while the human person, the personhood, is the realm of freedom. Kagaya nung sinasabi ko noon, nung unang meeting natin, yung meron ng preconceived idea, we are not yung sinasabi ni Socrates at ni Plato na we are not tabula rasa. We have knowledge of something that cannot be articulated by mere observation of available data. At ito yung common denominator ng mga societies before, except the Greeks, no. I am pertaining to Asian philosophy here, no, not the Greek philosophy. Kasi Greek philosophy believes in fate, F-A-T-E. They believe in destiny. Therefore, their notion of personhood, kahit may notion ng soul, is somewhat determined, not free. They did not elaborate on the concept of freedom. In fact, the first author, the first philosopher, actually theologian siya, the first author to speak of the problem of freedom is Origen. If you are studying theology, Origen is an early church father. Christianity ang nagpakilala ng konsepto ng freedom sa society. It's not the other philosophical systems. That's Christian philosophy. Doon pinakilala because doon na-articulate yung embodiment of the spirit during that era, no? Not prior. Then of course, that's the point now of debates and other discoveries ng mga sumunod na mga panahon. Now, the free act is not an act without cause, but it is the effect of a free cause. Seeing that free act exists and that it cannot be produced by nature, but rather only by the human person, and it is in the human person, in the being of the human person, doon lang din natin makikita, doon lang natin ma-research yung reason for the possibility of the free act. We cannot observe, we cannot research matter, the material world, for the possibility of the free act. It is only in the human person. Because we produce free act. We fulfill free act. It is only the spirit which is sovereign, which is free, which freely moves where it wishes, that we understand freedom. Therefore, on the same level with self-consciousness and objectivity, self-consciousness and objectivity both transcends matter. Freedom also is an unequivocal sign, impossible to confuse, of man's or of the human person's spiritual dimension. Therefore, freedom is the faculty which the human person has of being master and author of his or her own actions. It is sublime, but also very dangerous power. Freedom is somewhat described also as power. Sabi ni Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibilities. It is also safe to say that with great freedom comes great responsibility. That's the graph. It should be the graph. The greater the freedom, the greater the responsibility. The greater the freedom. Again, it is sublime, but also very dangerous power. Because in the hands of the human person, this is one argument against the existence, not against, this is one of the arguments on the existence of evil. Listen, in the hands of the human person, since we are free, freedom is a weapon of dual stature. It can be said that freedom is a double-edged sword. It is a double-edged sword. It can be adopted either for good or for evil. It can serve the human person for the cultivation, the promotion, the elevation, and the full realization of his or her own being. But it can also serve to obtain the opposite effects, to degrade, to humiliate and annihilate his own being. Now, with good use of freedom, the human person can become a hero, a saint, a benefactor of humanity. Meanwhile, with its evil use, the human person can become an addict, a parasite, a terrorist, a nemesis of humanity. Sakit no, no? Nemesis of humanity. Freedom is the great power that is given to the human person. Tayo. A being who when he or she comes into the world, doon pa lang sa conception, the development of this notion of freedom begins. With freedom, the human person is not only simply the master of his or her own acts, but also of himself. But mind you, the most difficult mastery of all is the mastery of the self. Most of the time, we tend to become impatient of ourselves. It is very difficult to tame ourselves, to master ourselves. That's difficult, but that's our movement. That's our progress. That should be our progress. The master of himself or herself, he or she is the master of his or her own becoming, more precisely of that which he or she will become. It's your choice because you have freedom. If you want to become an honest citizen, an industrious student, a generous person, or sa inyo rin yun, if you want to become an individual closed in himself or herself, an egoist, a miserly, quarrelsome, proud, lustful, invidious, or arrogant human person, because there's freedom. It's up to you. Now, for freedom as a gift to man, as a gift to the human person, be effectively human, we need to consider these three things. For freedom to be effectively human, no? Kasi this freedom will bring out the best in us. It should bring out the best in us. There are three things that we need to consider. Number one, the human person is not the supreme being, but rather a possibility tending to the infinite. Possibility because of the presence of the soul. The human person is not the supreme being, therefore you are not God. Sabi ni Peter Crave, one of my favorite philosopher and author, sabi niya, the disease the disease of man, the disease of the human person is this. He forgets these four very important words. God said, I am God, you are not. Man, the human person, is not the supreme being. Number two, the human person is not an isolated being. The human person is by force of his own nature a social being. We are in the context always of a society. We are made up for living, growing, and realizing ourselves in society, in communion with our own equals. And the realization of ourselves require a growth adequate of the social dimension of our own being. We are not in isolation. Next week, this will be our topic, intersubjectivity. We are not an enclosed I. I, ako. As in letter I. We are not an enclosed ako. I. You are not an enclosed I. But rather an open ako. An open I. The human person is I, thou. Ako, ikaw. Ako, ikaw. As narrated by Martin Buber, that will be our topic next week, intersubjectivity. By which, sabi ni Martin Buber, the growth of the ako, the growth of the I, is proportionate with the growth of the ikaw, the growth of the you. More than a Dasein, Heidegger said we are Dasein. We are being there. Our existence, we are being there. More than a Dasein, Ang spelling ng Dasein, hindi ko na ilagay sa PowerPoint. Nasa book nyo ito, yung word na Dasein, nasa book ninyo, kaya hindi ko sinulat. Dasein, Dasein, German, being there. The being of the human person is Mitsein. Mitsein, Mitsein. It is not being there, but Mitsein means being with. A being with. Therefore, the human person is a being that exercises freedom with and for others. With and for others. Because we're not beings in isolation. We are being in communion with others. We are being in society. Therefore, we exercise our freedom with and for others. At dyan din papasok yung limitations ng ating freedom. If we are already stepping on the freedom of others, because we are forgetting that we are exercising our freedom with others. And not just simply for ourselves, but also for others. Because we are being with. Meron tayong kasama. Hindi tayo nag-iisa. And thirdly, the human person is an incarnate spirit. Ano ibig sabihin ng incarnate? Incarne. Nagkaroon ng flesh. Matter. The body. Man is an incarnate spirit. Therefore, since we are an incarnate spirit, being in the world is our natural condition. Therefore, nature is not our enemy. The laws of nature is not our enemy. Therefore, nature is our principal and most earnest handmaiden. Therefore, our freedom cannot be turned against nature. Just as our freedom cannot be turned against God or against neighbor. This third implies that we as free beings, as being with Mitsein, should live in perfect harmony. That freedom should be used so as we can live in perfect harmony with the supreme being, with our neighbors, and with nature. That is the essence or the nature of freedom and the implication of freedom and responsibility. We should use this freedom to live in harmony with the supreme being, with our neighbors, and with nature. Because that's kung may something determined about us, that's it. That's what's determined. But still, even itong sinasabi natin, we should live in harmony with God, with neighbors, and with nature. The choice is always ours to make. The choice is still ours. Again, the author of the action, the one who fulfills the act, is the human person. The human person himself or herself. With that, I'll end lesson 1.2, the nature of freedom and responsibility. Questions? Clarification?